This week in Dallas, where I live, we weathered our now annual February ice storm. It started Monday afternoon, and by Tuesday, the roads were sheet ice. Amidst all the frustration of plans canceled, no school, and the horrific news of accidents all over the Metroplex, there is one thing about the storm that I find strikingly beautiful, and that is the ice-coated branches of the huge live oaks lining my street. They sparkle, and you can see how the drips have frozen like tiny, icy teardrops. Some of the more pliable trees were so weighed down with ice that their long limbs bent over the street, creating these kind of ice arches so low that cars could not pass. It amazes me how much trees can bend. Some of them bounce back once the temperatures rise and the ice drips away, but others can't tolerate the weight of the ice and they snap. These trees are so much like people and human communities. Some are able to bend, tolerating the forces of the world, but others can't. Some are rigid and others are flexible. As I learned from a roommate years ago who made classical guitars in our tiny little Boston apartment, most wood can tolerate bending, but it's a slow process. Tolerance of different perspectives, spiritual paths, ways of knowing God has been a defining quality of our Unitarian Universalist approach to religion. But for as long as it's been a core value, there have also been struggles with and debates about its scope and its application. How tolerant do we need to be? Must we tolerate intolerance? What if something or someone is a challenge to other core values that we hold? How far can we bend like the trees? What are the limits of tolerance? Unitarians have asked themselves these questions in the mid-19th century when a group of radical philosophers and theologians, the Transcendentalists, challenged the prevailing Unitarian ideas about how one connected with God and what were the essential elements of religion. In 1841, Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister, preached a sermon called A Discourse on the Transient and Permanent in Christianity, in which he said that the religion that Jesus taught, essentially love of God and of neighbor, remained permanent, but that the theologies and doctrines and traditions and all the trappings of church were merely transient. He challenged the purpose of church. And so, as you can imagine, other Unitarian clergy were a bit unhappy. His colleagues got together in these meetings and they fretted. They spent meetings going in circles asking, what are we going to do about him? Parker's words were an affront to their calling and their livelihood. And so they asked him to withdraw from ministerial fellowship, but he declined. In the words of the historian Conrad Wright, there was no way to exclude him without abandoning the principle of free inquiry. So several members said kind things about Parker's sincerity. He burst into tears and left the room, where a colleague shook him cordially by the hand and expressed the hope that he would come to see him soon. His colleagues decided that because of Parker's views, they could not have what they called ministerial intercourse with him. However, they hoped to still have a friendly and social intercourse. Parker's colleagues essentially tried to excommunicate him for his views, but in the process they realized that their commitment to tolerance and freedom in religion prohibited them from kicking him out. This episode in our history stretched the limits of tolerance. Parker went on to lead the 28th Congregational Society of Boston, which with 2,000 Sunday attendees could be considered the first Unitarian megachurch. And in many ways, he and his Transcendentalist friends transformed Unitarianism from within in the coming decades. Parker's contemporaries could not excommunicate him because tolerance and religious freedom were central to their Unitarian faith and had been for centuries. Early Unitarians had lived under threat of fines, prison, and even death. It was in a climate such as this that King John Sigismund of Transylvania issued the Edict of Torda over 450 years ago in 1568. The king was a Unitarian, the first and only Unitarian king in the history of the world. This edict, which you heard earlier from Reverend Scott, declared that no one should be compelled to believe a certain way or reviled for their religion. All religions, including Unitarianism, were legally recognized by the king, and he insisted that everybody be able to practice their religion free from persecution. This was very radical for the time. It was in looking back at these moments in 1568, 1841, and many other times and places that Unitarian historian Earl Morse Wilbur said that Unitarianism has been characterized by freedom, reason, and tolerance. And yes, some have referred to this as our Trinity. Tolerance, Wilbur said, is important, but not an ultimate good or final aim. Tolerance is a means by which we achieve the true ends of religion, helping people to know themselves as children of God and creating religious institutions that build and embody heaven on earth, he said. So what do we do when we encounter people or situations that challenge these ends or challenge our commitment to tolerance? Where do we draw the line? Or where can we draw the line? I ask myself these questions a lot these days about what's going on in our wider world. I imagine some of you do as well. We live in a society that is polarized on many issues. It's hard sometimes to know how to live our Unitarian Universalist values in this climate. What happens when your deepest values are challenged? How open and accepting and tolerant can you be as a Unitarian Universalist in these times? Is this an anything goes religion? My answer is an emphatic no, that's not what tolerance means or what tolerance asks of us. Tolerance, what crimes are committed in your name, says the poet Denise Levertov in Goodbye to Tolerance. And indeed, tolerance is a word, a value, and a practice that has a variety of expressions and a shadow side. When we lift up tolerance as a Unitarian Universalist value, there are a few things we do not mean. Levertov is saying to her fellow poets in the midst of the Vietnam War, we must not be indifferent and call it tolerance. She names many forms of indifference in the poem: neutrality, balanced judgment, irresponsiveness. None of these are the same as tolerance. A Benedictine nun blogger that I read recently said it this way. She said, being tolerant is never half-hearted, never not caring. Tolerance means welcoming the stranger, whereas indifference means ignoring them. We also see extreme individualism, bad behavior run rampant, and lack of accountability occur in the name of tolerance. The underlying belief is, I'm free to do whatever I want, and you have to tolerate it, because we all have inherent worth and dignity. But what is missing is regard for the good of others, for the inherent worth and dignity of all, and for the community. Where I draw the line is between tolerance of difference and tolerance of behavior. We are a religion that tolerates and celebrates all kinds of diversity and works to create a more equitable world. But we cannot be a religion that tolerates all behavior, refusing to condemn that which is truly evil and failing to confront behavior that denigrates individual and community wholeness. Levertov's poem, I believe, is as resonant today as it was in 1975. How can we be neutral, indifferent, or irresponsive to what is happening in our country and in our world right now. To immigrant families, to children, to women and trans people, to communities of color. We cannot respond to what's happening with, well, it's a free country, because it's not for everyone. Have you ever been in a community that struggled with inclusion? I bet many of us have. With people who didn't fit in, or people who acted out, people who had different opinions or theologies or political persuasions than the majority. If so, you know the challenge of defining the limits of tolerance. Where do we turn in situations like these? Well, as a church community, we turn to covenant. There are limits to Unitarian Universalist tolerance, and they're defined by covenant and informed by our theology of love. Rather than being a faith whose limits are defined by a creed of beliefs, we are a faith defined by covenant, the mutual promises and commitments that we make about how we will be with each other, which include love, respect, striving to build a world of peace and justice, and nurturing and supporting one another's spiritual growth. The way we are together is important. When people engage in behavior that goes against the commitments and values of our covenant, what tolerance requires of us is to welcome them by calling them back into covenant. In 2014, First Unitarian Universalist Church in New Orleans put this covenant into action when members of Operation Save America, a fundamentalist Christian anti-abortion organization, interrupted their worship service. This is the same organization that targeted Dr. George Tiller, who was murdered for his work as an abortion provider. During a moment of silence in the service, one of the group leaders began to yell about abominations, condemning the church for their work on reproductive justice. The minister who was leading the service asked the OSA members either to stay and to be respectful or to leave. Church members escorted the more vocal protesters out of the service, and others stayed and tried to engage church members after the service during the coffee hour. As this was happening, though, in the service, the youth who were being honored that Sunday as part of the service began to sing, leading the congregation members to form a circle around the sanctuary. They literally defined the limits of tolerance for that church in that moment, through an invitation to respectful worship and by forming a circle of singing. It wasn't about whether you were pro-choice or pro-life, but it was about how you engaged with one another in that space. They invited the intruders into covenant and set clear limits for those who could not or would not respect it. There are so many less dramatic ways in which we do this, again and again, in our lives and in our communities. We show respect for difference and invite respect in return. When we fully embrace difference while setting limits, we can grow as individuals and as a community. Covenant holds differences in a way that promotes respect and wholeness. We have the opportunity to learn from our neighbors who experience life and God differently than we do because they may know something important that we have not yet experienced. I'm reminded of the story of the blind people and the elephant. Do you know that story? There were 6 blind people who lived together in a community, and one day a neighbor announced that an elephant had arrived in their village. They didn't know what an elephant was, and so they decided to use their sense of touch to learn. One person touched the smooth side, one touched the round trunk, one touched the sharp tusk, one touched the very tall leg, another touched the wide ear, and another touched the thin tail. And so then they began to argue about what an elephant was, each thinking that they were right. A wise person passed by and saw all of this commotion happening and stopped to ask what was going on. And they responded, "The elephant is a big animal. None of you felt the whole elephant, only a little part. The elephant actually has all of the features that you mentioned, so you're all right. Each of those people had had a real encounter with the elephant, but no one of them alone encountered the whole elephant. It's the same with religious experience and truth. This is why it's okay if the people in the pews next to you don't believe the same as you. It's also why a few years ago, the church I serve, First Unitarian Church in Dallas, invited a man named Rob Schenck, a pro-life evangelical Christian minister, to speak on the chancel after a screening of the documentary Armor of Light. It's a film about his journey to develop a moral and ethical response to gun violence within the evangelical community, and his questioning of whether being pro-gun is consistent with being pro-life. He joined forces with Lucy McBath, the mother of Jordan Davis, an unarmed Black teenager who was murdered in Florida a few years ago, to engage in a political response to these issues. They found common ground, and we found common ground in our desire to address gun violence in America from a faithful perspective. This was a powerful example of tolerance. Being who we are, a church with a long, proud history of reproductive justice, but also inviting in someone with different religious views than us, with whom we shared a commitment to ending gun violence. We did not give up who we are, and he did not give up who he is, but we listened to each other and found a common commitment. Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker reflects on tolerance and our theology of love in a way that resonates both in the context of church community, but also in personal relationships. She writes, "In the practice of tolerance, we begin to let go of all our preset opinions, our prejudices about each other. Instead of seeing the other through the veil of our preset opinions of who they are or what their value is, we let that fog part and become more and more open to the other as a real presence. And so we begin to see the uniqueness, the particularity of each one next to us. We don't define who they are. We allow them to define to us who they are. A greater intimacy is experienced, a more vivid presence of others. There's a name for this: love. The practice of tolerance comes down to love," she says. So how do we get to a place where difference isn't threatening, where instead difference calls us to love? Writer and activist Audre Lorde, in her book Sister Outsider, rightly points out that difference is threatening in large part because even with all of our differences, we are bound up together in an interdependent web. We're interrelated. We are different, but we're not separate. And this closeness is what can feel threatening. It's when we're able to celebrate our differences that our interdependence as people becomes unthreatening. Lorde writes, "Only within that interdependency of different strengths, acknowledged and equal, can the power to seek new ways of being in the world generate, as well as the courage and sustenance to act where there are no charters." So difference sparks creativity, and it creates possibility. In this moment in which we live, when difference continues to be threatening to many, and we struggle to define the limits of openness and tolerance, we can look to those who came before us in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. We have something to learn from them about steadfast tolerance, as well as the power of covenant for building community and establishing accountability. Let us not be overtaken by fear. Let us rest firmly in our covenant, our commitments, and our theology of love, defining our limits and calling one another back into covenant. From this place, we can continue our living tradition of tolerance within the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. May it be so for you, for this church, and for our world. Amen. Amen.